right. So in this lecture, we're going to be covering a lot of different things, but mainly coming to talk about ability status and ableism, and age status and ageism, and adultism. So because of that, I'm going to break up this particular lecture in different parts. So the first half, we're going to be covering exclusively about ableism and about ability status. In the second half of this particular video, we're going to be covering age status and ageism and adultism. Before we get started, just a reminder about your assignments. So your lecture reflections for this particular lecture is going to be due on October 9th at 5 p.m. And your discussion questions for the upcoming lecture on sexual orientation, sexual diversity, and heterosexism is going to be due Monday, October 5th at 2 p.m. So let's go ahead and get started. Before we move over into talking about ability status and talking about ableism, it's really important to understand the main, some important terms. So we're going to cover disability, and very broadly, and as defined by the American Disabilities Act and by the American Disability Association, it's a physical and mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And my question to you is, what do you think of when you hear life activities? So when we think about life activities, these are the things that include cooking, driving, so forth and so on. And when we have this impairment, or when there's impairment, anything that impedes or limits one or more of these activities, there is there's a chance that the person has a disability. Now, with this particular definition, it covers a wide variety of impairments. So sensory impairments, language impairments, psychological and emotional disorders, neurodevelopmental and other psychological disorders, orthopedic conditions, TBIs, chronic illnesses, you name it. So everything that is seen, any impairment that is seen and unseen. And a lot of times within our society, people perceive disabilities as one-dimensional. And it's so much more than that. And when we talk about ableism, we're going to talk about the ways in which it creates this idea of disabilities being seen only in one dimension. And when we get to talking about intersectionality, you'll see what I'll get at. So ableism, what is it? Basically, what this is a system of discrimination and exclusion of people living with disabilities. And much like how we talked about oppression, this operates on the individual, institutional, and cultural levels. So when it comes to individual, these might be interpersonal, they accompany microaggressions. And when it gets to institutional and cultural, this is a lot broader. But remember, with institutional and cultural levels, these facilitate those interpersonal individual experiences with oppression. So we're going to talk about institutional and cultural in a lot more detail a little bit later. Something important to know about ableism is that people that are privileged within the system are those who are able-bodied, and even those who are temporarily able-bodied. And it disadvantages people living with a disability. So the point being is, with this particular system of oppression, it privileges people, people who are able-bodied physically and psychologically, and disadvantages people with mental and physical impairments. So I mentioned talking about it at the individual level. So within this particular level, there's a lot of development of discriminatory attitudes and behaviors towards people with living with disabilities. So this might be done within medicine, where doctors are engaging in ways that discredit the patient or the client. Education. When we think about accommodations, there's a lot that goes into it. If we're looking at Tech's campus, the room that we would have been, it would be on the second floor of Woodard Hall. And if you've been in Woodard Hall before, have you noted any elevators? Okay. Have you noted that, does Tech have a lot of ramps? Is there any parts of Tech's setting that have Braille on them? So while we do have the office of, we have an office that does accommodate people living with disabilities, there still are some things about the structure of Tech's campus that may not fully be helpful for people living with disabilities. And in the media, what we see when we think about beauty standards within our society, very broadly, we value people who are perceived as intelligent, people who are able-bodied, people who are able to be independent, physically and psychologically independent. So that was the quick spiel. We're gonna go more into these a little bit later, but just to get you thinking about the ways in which maybe you have noticed or you haven't noticed different parts of society, or not society per se, but different parts of your experiences that have promoted ableism. Also, to make note, at the individual level, because there are these attitudes and behaviors, these reinforce the institutional policies and practices in relation to people living with disabilities. And we talked a lot about microaggressions in the last chapter. Well, excuse me, the last lecture. So here's a list of ableist microaggressions. So there are different themes here. And if you take a look at them, what they really get at is the denial and invalidation of people living with disabilities and their reality. So if we go here to this theme, denial of personal identity, I can't believe you are married. So what this communicates is that there's no part of your life that is normal like mine. The only thing when I see you is your disability. Remember when we talked about when we talked about the different types of microaggressions, this is more along the lines of micro invalidations. Given that what it's doing is denying this person's reality and moving the target, moving that person to think that their reality is not like the person who has delivered that microaggression. Another one, something that's typically common, helplessness, occurs when people frantically try to help people with disabilities. So for example, someone helps you on a train or a bus, even when you don't need any help. Or someone feels incapable of rescuing you from your disability. So when we're looking at these particular things, right, a lot of times we've seen people on the street assisting someone with disabilities, especially when they have, their own handle on things. Now, is there something wrong to assist someone when you can tell that they need help? No, there's nothing wrong with that. In the event that they come into contact with you and ask for help. But when you're doing it in a way to almost take care of that person or infantize that person, so to speak, then that's when the behavior becomes concerning. And that, at that point, becomes the microaggression. Another one, infantilization. This occurs when someone with a disability is being treated like a child. Quote unquote, let me do that for you. It communicates that that person's not really capable, and I know better than you know how to do this. So this is this is something that we see very much within the field of medicine. We'll go more into detail about that, but what it comes off as is this paternalistic behavior that in this idea that someone with disabilities don't know what's best for them, and that a person who is able-bodied does. All right. Another one here, not one that's not that much talked about, but something that's really, really important. Desexualization. This occurs when sexuality and sexual being is denied. Quote, I would never date someone who uses a wheelchair, unquote. So while this is more, we recognize this as a micro insult. And what this communicates to the person is that a person living with disabilities is not attractive, nor are they equal or even worthy of being with me. And there's a lot of discourse around people with disabilities and their sexuality, their sexual engagement, their sexual realities being denied simply because of their disability. So taken together, these are some of the microaggressions that people with disabilities not only experience, but report within their life. So think about this for yourself. Have you heard or have you said or done any of these things before? And now that you're learning about these, or if you haven't learned about these, what is that like for you to hear about them now? And how does that move you to think about your own behavior when it comes to ableism within your everyday life and in your interactions with people with disabilities? So I'm curious to hear about that. Um, and that might be something to explore within your lecture reflection. So at the institutional level, I mentioned before when we talk about medicine, what we have seen historically and within contemporary history, like right now, we've seen the medicalization of people with disabilities. And this has a lot of historical roots within the rise of science and medicine within the daily lives of average people. So within medicine, what we have seen is the ways in which medical doctors um, facilitate ableist microaggressions and also reinforce um, these ableist beliefs um, within medicine. And a lot of times, and if it, not even a lot of times, many times, excuse me, many times within medicine, there isn't that much discussion around ableism. So remember when we think about at the institutional level, what is going on? And if you think about it, there's not a lot of training, not a lot of discussions, open discussions about interactions as medical doctors, medical professionals, and people with disabilities. When it comes to the needs of people with disabilities, what often happens is that the doctor facilitating these ableist microaggressions onto the patient. And a lot of times that comes off as very paternalistic, focusing only on the concerns through a medical lens. So really overall, within medicine, we do see a control of different needs of PWDs. Now, when we think about education, is something really big is the ways in which decisions at the institutional level or um, within education are used for educating people with disabilities. And while the Americans with Disabilities Act and the amendments have passed, um, we do still recognize some unequal access. When it comes to building modifications, I mentioned earlier that within Woodard Hall, there isn't a elevator to get to the second floor. In Keeney Hall, there is. Another thing to think about, when we think about Keeney Hall, for example, from what I've seen, I haven't seen a ramp to get into Keeney Hall. And from what I know, the back door, when it's locked by 5 p.m., no one can get in, which I recognize as which it's recognized because you don't want people going into the cashier's office. And at the same time, what if a person who experiences a physical disability wanted to get in to do group therapy that's offered at 5 p.m.? It's not that accessible to go in through the front door either. So these might be little tiny things, but they make a big difference. So something to think about is when you're going through when you're walking onto campus, note the little things that are missing within the buildings that you go to class in. And granted, you're in Zoom, so that's different. But even with Zoom, there are still some things that may not be readily accessible for people with students with disabilities. Closed captions as examples. Changes in standard procedures. So A lot of times when there's a student with a disability, there are ways in which they have to proceed. And a lot of times it's put on that student, not so much on the instructor. And that's really important to think about, because the instructor is the one that is to facilitate the accommodations for the student. Now, at the same time, while I do believe it's important for people to do what they have to do, or do the responsible thing, there is the concern that instructors or professors may not know their role in that particular procedure. And then because of that, there isn't a clear idea on how to meet the needs of those students. Another big thing, they may not get their accommodations on time. So when it comes to doing all of that work, now don't get me wrong, TDS, they do a very good job at doing their best. They do their best to help students. That is something that I really want to highlight. However, when we look at it on average, some students may not get, and I say on average, across different institutions. Students living with these disabilities may not get, or often don't get their accommodations in a timely manner. So by the time that they file their paperwork and classes have started, they may not have their accommodations for them. And I mentioned earlier, faculty and staff aren't really aware of their obligations to these students. So that makes it additional, that adds into the stressors for students with these disabilities, in that they may have to disclose what their needs are, and this might lead the student to disclose their disability if it is not something that they want to disclose. Minimal training, there might just be a slide mentioned about accommodations for instructors, for faculty and staff, and that's it, a slide. You get all of your training, all of your knowledge about this from one slide. The point is, faculty and staff the most that they may get is minimal training, and that's only just for a day. And think about that, because if only some of them are getting that training, there are others that are not getting it at all. At the administration level, the creation of the programs to accommodate people with disabilities may be perceived as time-consuming and expensive. So overall, there we go. So overall, when we're looking at ableism within education, while we have the ADA and the amendments that have passed, we still see a lot of the inequity for students living with disabilities. And that's really important to note, because research has shown, or has suggested, that students living with disabilities, because there's a harder time to engage in their education. And with some students who engage, they may not finish their degree because of the difficulties that they face. At the cultural level, these are more so of these stereotypical beliefs. And so I want to pose this question to you and just give you a minute or two to reflect on it. What are some stereotypes of people living with disabilities that you've heard, in the media, from family, from peers, from that one uncle at Thanksgiving or aunt. So what have you heard? Okay. So we did talk a little bit about stereotypical beliefs. Um, the idea that people with disabilities need help. Um, they're seen as infants. They're not sexual beings, so forth and so on. What there is also the experience of invisibility. So let me go back to that. So there's this experience of being the other, while at the same time not being recognized. So when we talked about marginalization within the oppression lecture, part of it is that this person or this group, um, typically the dominant group, create these conceptions of those who are marginalized. And these conceptions move this group, move the marginalized group into being the other. And when the marginalized group has made their attempt to be recognized, they're discounted, they're invisible. So this is something that we see within ableism. When a person with disabilities is advocating for themselves, they may be denied and discounted. And at the same time, people will have these visions of them or this conception of the person's disability. Lack of inclusiveness and supports. So when we think about role models, for example, especially ones that are within the media, how often have you seen actors living with disabilities within like mainstream media? And when I'm talking that they're playing, and these actors, they play, when I mean the actors playing within mainstream media and movies, I'm talking about those um, who are the main character and not supporting, or the ones who just appear in one episode. Yeah. So very broadly, when it comes to mainstream media and film, major films, there is not a lot of discussion or representation of people with disabilities within movies. While um, there has been growing representation compared to how it's always been historically, is rather scant. So taken together, not a lot of role models that are being displayed. And oftentimes, how often have you had a character living with a disability that was the main character? Aside from Glee. And if you remember what Glee was like this, Glee was this TV show where people sang. It was a TV version of High School Musical. And on that show was who was part of the Glee Club, was a young man who was, if I'm trying to remember correctly, he's paraplegic. I do not remember his name. And for me, that was one time where I saw someone living with a disability that was the main character. There also was a person who played a character with a hearing impairment in Weeds. And this particular character appeared within 2 seasons and within the last episode of the 8th season. And oftentimes within movies, when there is a character living with an impairment, and especially a psychological impairment, they're perceived as vicious and violent, and especially some of the disturbing TV shows, like horror movies, they're deranged killers. And something to really note, this facilitates discussion um, within our reality of people who have a psychological disorder being perceived as violent. And I want to pose this question to folks. Are people with psychological disorders more likely to be a perpetrator of violence? And in a minute or two, I'll give you the answer. All right, you ready for the answer? People with psychological disorders are more likely to be victims of violence. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So when we talk about the experience of people with disabilities, there's a lot of stuff going on here. There's inadequate communication, transportation, education, daily living needs, funding, timely provision of access, and service delivery. Even further, there's not a lot of access to these facilities and services and activities. And oftentimes when there is access, it's challenging, and they have to require additional planning and understanding on the part of that person. When it comes to attempting gaining access, that can often be isolating and disempowering, given the ways in which people interact with them. People within these systems interact and deliver microaggressions. So imagine trying to get yourself, trying to advocate for yourself, and your reality is denied. People invalidate you. So something to think about as we're moving throughout this particular lecture. When it comes to violence in particular, while we have seen an increase in hate crimes against people of racial and ethnic minority status, religious status, we've also seen hate crimes against people with disabilities. And oftentimes, these crimes aren't reported. And mainly it's in fear of being stigmatized. And often these hate crimes are not seen as hate crimes. Instead, they're just simply seen as an assault. Now, for folks who might not be familiar, a hate crime is something completely different from that of an assault. When we're thinking about being processed criminally, excuse me. And a lot of times when it does come to hate crimes, especially against people with disabilities, there's not a lot of investigation into it. All right, so I know that was a long pause. I needed to grab some water. So now we're going to talk about beauty standards. So really when it comes to folks living with disabilities, oftentimes you don't get to see a lot of people living with disabilities in beauty commercials, um, magazines, so forth and so on. As a society, this is, we don't see a lot of that. We don't see a lot of representation in that this society values anything, any aspect that's related to strength and intellect. Within mainstream media, beauty means perfection in all areas. Um, and oftentimes we celebrate people who are physically strong and intellectually smart, and we discount the value of anyone who doesn't meet any of those standards. And people living with those, without those abilities to be smart and strong, physically strong. Something important to make note of too within media and communication, right? This is often centered on visual and auditory abilities until you put the closed captions on the news, whatever it may be. What you don't see a lot of times are captions or interpreters. Recently, there has been, interpreters have always been, a thing at major events. There are times when there isn't an interpreter, and it's harder for people with those abilities, with auditory impairments. It doesn't provide them with more to their experience. It basically puts it on them to be able to experience the experience fully. So now we're going to talk about the history of ableism. So when it has come to the historical treatment of people with disabilities, it originally was rooted within religious lens. And the way in which we've done treatment is the way in which our culture has understood it. So initially, with treatment, people understood illnesses through a religious lens, and people examined disabilities through that same lens. And oftentimes, sorry about that. And oftentimes, the disability was understood to be a condition that could never be changed because of sin. And so that person was often stigmatized, and there were attempts based upon the religious to exercise or excuse the sin as best as they could. Ultimately, what we have found was that it did not do what the treatment was not helpful in any way. And if you were living with a disability back in the 19th century or earlier, oftentimes there was a lot of concerns. For example, infants with disabilities were often dropped off balconies to their deaths. Children with disabilities were abandoned and left to live on the streets, and they didn't have any choice but to beg for food and money. Now, the term handicapped emerged from England when people with disabilities would use their cap in the hand on the street corners to plead for money. And a lot of times, people with disabilities were placed in jails and asylums where they endured a lot of inhumane treatment. People with psychological impairments and I'm talking about psychological disorders, some heavy psychopathology, they're often strapped to beds, left alone, not being treated nicely by the staff. Um, there was a lot of different therapies that were being done. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that when we get to the medicalization part. There are different therapies that were done to alleviate some of these symptoms. And a lot of the times, these treatments did not assist that person in any way. Instead, it created more psychological distress. So within the early 18th century, people with disabilities were seen as quote unquote freaks or monsters and subhuman. And a lot of the times, those with disabilities went into these shows, what would be called freak shows, and they would entertain people who were curious about them. Now, while it was stigmatizing and unsettling, people with disabilities were able to make money from these type of this form of entertainment. That was actually one of the most viable ways that they could get money. If you've seen American Horror Story, I'm trying to remember. It might have been the fourth season, the circus, or it was Freak Show. I can't recall, but in essence, people with disabilities would live in the same vicinity, engage with one another, and have their life, and live a life like everyone else does, with the exception that they would be stigmatized for doing so. In one of the episodes of that particular season, the group went to a diner, and they were treated in a way that was rather unsettling. So historically, what we found is people living with disabilities, they were not treated in the best manner. Now, I mentioned medicalization earlier. Really what this was, you started seeing the rise of medicine. Scientific and medical fields became more powerful, and their guidelines began to shape the ways in which disabilities were perceived and how they were understood. And early Western medicine classified people with disabilities as defective, and that this was on a genetic basis, and that they could only be fixed or healed, so to speak, through medicine. Oops, let me go back. So this particular thing, it fostered the belief that people with disabilities needed to be monitored, to be controlled by physicians and medical specialists with authoritarian powers. So oftentimes this resulted in some paternalistic treatment for people with disabilities. And when it came to the ways in which doctors would treat these folks, oftentimes these were very invasive methods. They were very harmful. They involved surgery and drugs, and they would require that person to submit to that expert as the authority of their life. And this is a view that still is very much pervasive today. Like I mentioned before earlier, when we talk about medical doctors, a lot of times what we've seen is the ways in which there's paternalistic treatment of people with disabilities. Now, it is important to recognize that doctors are doctors have a certain expertise. And at the same time, the question I pose to people is, does that necessarily mean that 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 person with expertise knows better than the person than the person that they're treating, especially someone with disabilities? So that's my question that I pose to y'all, and I'm curious of what y'all think about that. We've also seen a lot of changes with language within, Western history. During the 1880s and 90s, people would use the term quote unquote mentally retarded or mental retardation. And a lot of times this was in reference to people with intellectual disabilities. And it's important to recognize that that term is really outdated. We do not use that term. And it is very derogatory. Another term was medical imbecility. And this particular term, it also referenced people with an intellectual disability, but it also was used in reference to prostitutes, immigrants, and other people who were not able to express themselves in English. So overall, when it came to language, people who were perceived as different, people who spoke differently, people with a living disability, not people living with disabilities, excuse me, especially those with intellectual disability, there was some rather derogatory language aimed at these particular folks. It's also important to note that within the early 19th century, you had the eugenics movement. And if you're familiar with that movement, awesome. I won't have to explain it as much, but for those who are not that familiar with it, the eugenics movement was basically this push for the promotion of people with good genes. And that was very vague in understanding. And what I mean by that is there wasn't, people noted that what this meant was that people who were white, people who were rich, people who did not have, people who were able-bodied, people who were English, people who spoke English, excuse me. And so when we think about eugenics, it's really, or it was a science that was supposed to, quote unquote, improve the qualities of race by controlling human breeding. And a lot of times what you found, people with disabilities were often sterilized, along with people who were poor, people who were non-white, especially that of women. So you can imagine that people who were non-white living with a disability, what their experience was like. You also saw genocidal policies within during World War II, where people with physical and psychological impairments were shot, and also to note people of other races, such as Jewish folks, Polish folks, and other groups, people who were LGBT. They were either shot, gassed, or left to death to starve. Oops. Let's go back. Now, after World War II, something to make note, veterans who returned from World War II with a disability, there was a new focus within medicine to rehabilitate these folks. And this led to the development of devices that would help these soldiers to return to work and live productive lives instead of being restricted to hospitals and asylums. while you did have this new development, people living with these disabilities were still treated um, not in the nicest manner. They were often segregated and treated as patients who needed supervision and care from other people who knew best. And within the 1960s and in the 70s, you saw this new movement arise, this social movement. Um, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But for reference, it's called the independent living movement. And this was on the heels of the civil rights movement and the feminist movements. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But overall, this is the historical review. And this is a very broad review. I do recognize that. It's a very broad historical overview of the treatment of people living with disabilities. Now, what has psychology's role been in this particular part? Of note, psychology has a history of creating disorders, in particular to a subordinated group. For example, drapetomania. If you're not familiar with drapetomania, this was a term coined by Samuel L. Cartwright. He was a Louisiana physician, and this term was applied to slaves. So what this term meant was this feeling or this urge to run away and from oftentimes, quote unquote, a good situation. Well, this was used to justify the recapturing of African slaves who ran from plantations. And there was this conception that slave masters were treating slaves in the best manner, where they would be given food and shelter, and oftentimes, not even often, majority of the time, slaves were not treated nicely. They were kept in shacks with holes in them, with horrible living conditions, and they would be fed scraps. So drapetomania would be used as a way of, so to speak, diagnosing that slave that ran away and treating them with treatment that would be perceived as appropriate. And oftentimes that would include whippings. Hysteria. So I believe early in one of the lectures, I talked about hysteria. And hysteria was one of the terms discussed within psychoanalytic literature, most notably among Sigmund Freud. And he suggested that women were just crazy. Women wanted to be men. They envied men, and they wanted to be men very badly. So the lens in which that particular theory viewed women was very pathologizing. It was very male-centric. Another one, homosexuality. So up until the 1940s, within the DSM, this is a diagnostic statistical manual. It's used to diagnose psychological disorders. It's basically a huge book with like the list of disorders that you can diagnose someone with. It's currently in its 5th edition. And prior to the, let's say, I believe the 2nd or the 3rd, I'll get that information to you guys. It's a lot of history to remember. Being gay was considered to be a psychological disorder. And it wasn't until the 1970s that psychologists were like, not psychologists, excuse me, because psychiatrists make this particular book, that these professionals were saying, well, it must not be a disorder anymore. Well, but during that time, people who were gay were being treated with electroshock therapy, hydrotherapy, conversion therapy, all of which have not converted or healed people of being gay. or bisexual. The point being is that um, the point of this particular slide is to show the ways in which psychology has had a role in the facilitation of ableism, and one that is often not talked about. So I'm curious what folks think about this particular slide and what do they think about psychology. And it's important to note too that these are very much outdated beliefs and conceptions um, within our DSM. Now we're going to talk about the movements within that have the movements that have resisted ableism. All right. So now we're going to talk about the disability rights movement. So if you remember this picture here, you might have seen it in some history textbooks, but this is the moment where the Civil Rights Act was passed. So I put this up here because within that document, there is the basically discrimination based upon race, gender, in particular race, excuse me, was not appropriate anymore, was not legal. Now, when it comes to that particular document, it did not include people with disabilities. So with the disability rights movement, it actually was on the heels of the civil rights movement and also the feminist movement. And during that particular time, with this document, and with that particular movement, there wasn't a lot of recognition or knowledge on, or even the capabilities of people with disabilities. And there are many misconceptions of people with disabilities. So, for example, at the time when, so let me go back. There was actually a bill that was introduced in the Congress that would amend Title VI of the Civil Rights Act that would prohibit discrimination upon physical or psychological impediments. But that died in the committee. And another bill in 1972 was introduced, and that also died in the committee. So when we think about the lack of concern that was demonstrated by Congress, this is more about the reflection on basically the ignorance of needs and capabilities of people with disabilities instead of the blatant desire to deny the civil rights of people. So at that time, employment wasn't considered to be forceful or forced to do much up until that Civil Rights Act. But with people with disabilities, employers shouldn't, at that time, employers weren't thought to be forced to hire people who couldn't perform abilities required. And a lot of times people with disabilities and their friends weren't advocating for employment of non-qualified persons. They're basically asking employers to look beyond their disability and to match them with the required job. And a lot of employers, they had a lot of misconceptions about people with disabilities or regarding the employment of people with disabilities. For example, they may not be able to secure insurance for the person, and the company's insurance premiums would rise. Another one was the belief that persons with disabilities were unsafe employees. Now, this particular belief didn't make sense given that they were actually doing, they had like safety records to indicate they had fewer accidents than able-bodied employees. Even further, many employers recognize that they would have to be making accommodations. Um, oops. They'd have to make these accommodations and perceive these to be expensive, um, when it may not even be expensive at all. Um, it actually can be done inexpensively. Oops, let me go back. So other misconceptions that were, firmly held, they occurred by employees mainly because uh, there wasn't a vigorous attempt to advocate against them, or to dispute them. With minority status, we recognize that political progress occurs when there is pressure. When we look at the civil rights movement, for example, and the feminist movement, we saw a lot of progress there. We also saw a lot of progress when you had the gay pride parades, you had the gay rights movement, um, so forth and so on. We recognized by putting that pressure can be helpful. Well, can create progress. Important to note that when it came for people with disabilities, they weren't recognized as minorities until 1973, where they were considered to be a quote unquote class of people. So, in particular, disabilities were seen as a secondary identity and not so much as a culture. When we go back to the oppression chapter, right? Remember how oppression, and yes, it was oppression, excuse me. When we talked about social construction, this is really important in understanding this particular statement. Mainly in that the way in which we understand our realities through language and even further through the culture um, is important. So overall, while there wasn't a recognized culture of people with disabilities, there was a culture already, one that people with disabilities had created. Not created, it just was, that was something that was there. It was shared beliefs, shared groups. So when we think about this particular thing, the rights and privileges, um, you know, when people think about rights and privileges, it's more so in reference to somebody's gender or race or national origin. And a lot of times people don't think about disability, or excuse me, ability status. For example, um, when we think about ability status, it's seen as a secondary identity. So I have the term up here, disabled woman. So to be more specific, the person is considered to be a disabled female or a disabled American female, not the person living with the disability. So it's important to recognize this dual and oftentimes triple classification, that the disability label was not considered a class into itself. If this isn't that clear, please be sure to email me and I'll do my best to elaborate on that. The point being is that being seen as a person with a disability was seen secondary in nature and not necessarily as a minority status. Another reason for the lack of class status was that there was a large number, not was, there is a large number of impediments. And each one is, considered separate within its own identity. Something to make note of within this particular group, members saw themselves as a minority, even before the passage of the Rehabilitation Act. And they began to view their life as having been deprived of basic human rights, very much similar to that of other minority groups. So you can imagine, and also think about people with additional marginalized identities. Think about the ways in which that oppression, that marginalization was intersectional. So a Black woman living with a disability. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that with COVID. So despite the concerns of, seen by charitable organizations in Congress, one aspect that was often missing was the involvement of people with disabilities. A lot of times, not even a lot of times, but with the legislation that we talked about in the previous slide, it was developed with like little input from people with disabilities. These charitable organizations established telethons to raise money for research and to provide services without giving much thought about what persons with disabilities were thinking about. They weren't even thinking of it as a, paternalistic. It was considered to be business as usual. So when we think about these organizations, they were doing their best to mean no harm. Well, I say the people with non-disabled people were doing their best to do no harm. And at the same time, they treated persons with disabilities as though they weren't able to make their own conceptions or view their experience the way that they viewed it. And it's important to remember here that intent is the difference between intent and impact, because you can have good intentions and still facilitate a negative impact. Impact is always, always, always important, no matter how good the intentions. And this is what we saw. Oops. So I did not click the buttons for all of these points. But the overall point was that you had well-intentioned, able-bodied people doing the work, and then at the same time, facilitating a rather adverse impact for people living with disabilities. They were making decisions, doing things that concerned persons with disabilities, and facilitated this paternalistic attitude within their doing. So when we think about activism within the disability rights movement was mainly focused on self-help, demedication demands, and consumerism. Another big part of it is that it focused on self-care rights and deinstitutionalism. So when we think about vocation, when we think about work, work in the United States is a vital aspect of the American life. And part of it is because that's just what we value. We value people being able to go out to work and contributing to our society. Now, a lot of that comes from nationalism and from some other things that we would talk about. But for this particular lecture, we're going to talk about it in a way that persons with disabilities were seen as unpatriotic and dependent because of their disabilities. Richard Nixon, former President Richard Nixon, he vetoed the legislation that would advocate a broader non-vocational role for rehabilitation programs on the basis that it strayed too far from the essential vocational objective of the program. Vocational, we're going to underline that here. This act was really important because it had provisions for independent living centers, and it would only take 6 more years before this concept would become a reality. Once again, though, we saw someone who was able-bodied intervene within the life or concerns of persons with disability. So there was also additional legislation that was passed that had provisions to issue directives against discrimination and adverse treatment. And before we move on into that movement, the independent living movement, I want folks to think about this word dependence. When you hear dependence, what do you think of, or what have you heard? So the independent living movement, we're going to talk about a lot of different things. And we're going to start off with talking about independence. And that is a very valued aspect within American society. It's considered to be an essential building block in constructing and maintaining a democracy, and freedom is dependent upon the citizens having that independence to build better lives for themselves and in the process of accomplishing their dreams. There's this lifting of freedom and democracy to different levels. Now, with dependence, that is stigmatized. It's not valued, and it's often considered a lower position within the social totem pole. So a lot of people perceive dependent as lacking initiative, being lazy, and a burden upon society. One of the statements that people, when you hear dependence, or you talk about social welfare programs, people talk about people being dependent upon the system. And oftentimes, this is said in a way that is rather demeaning. And persons with disabilities were often dehumanized and perceived as dependent, and as a result being devalued simply because of their ability status. So given that we place like this high value on independence, persons with disabilities or with illnesses, they were often placed in these situations where they would be in the care of family, where they would be in the state of dependency. And for some, it was a permanent situation, and for others, it was a majority. And the degree to which a person becomes dependent is affected by several things. And some of these are attitudes, and attitudes of family, friends, medical personnel, and employers have an impact on the level of dependency um, of that person with a disability. So when it comes to our American society, persons with disabilities, um, there's this recognition that um, they have a limited role within society, and it's often drafted for them. They're socialized into these roles. And when there's awareness around that, there's resentment. So when this movement began to arise, persons with disabilities believed that real freedom, or true freedom, relied on the ability to take control and maintain it. And with that, that resulted in the development of independent living centers. There's a brief history about it, where a small group of persons with disabilities at the University of Illinois and at UC Berkeley, they moved out of their hospital settings and into a community where they organized their own system of delivery for survival services. And that these centers were established by students, and that these became the blueprints for future centers. With the concept of independent living, this is basically where there's control over one's life, and that is only or predominantly based on choice of acceptable options that oftentimes minimize relying on other people and relying on people to perform, to make decisions and perform everyday activities. The point is of this concept is that persons with disabilities could manage on their own affairs and participate as full members in society. Within this particular movement, the environment was problematic, and the person is placed at the center, not the environment. So with this particular movement, not only did it focus on the living, the life activities, daily life activities, and also focused on vocational stuff. I mentioned work is like a central part for the American life, and it's considered to be an identity. When someone who has retired, a lot of times they say, oh, I'm a retired veteran, or I'm a retired nurse, I'm a retired doctor, so forth and so on. And oftentimes it's considered to be patriotic if you're working. There's a lot of stigmatizing discourse around people who don't work, or people who are unable to work. And a lot of things within American society are organized around us doing work. And a lot of that is from capitalism. And we'll talk about that particular ism within the last day. So hold on to your hats. We're going to be talking about that later. The point being is that because we're in this capitalistic society, a lot of the things in which we do are structured around working. So there's this promotion in these belief systems, such as meritocracy, this idea that if you work hard, you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you should be able to make it. And the concern is that with meritocracy in particular, it moves on this assumption that you can move up in your work. It's important to note, though, meritocracy is a myth. And I outlined that a lot more in detail in the capitalism lecture, but very briefly, I'll explain why it is considered to be a myth. So meritocracy does not take into account the inequities that a person has and are currently facing. So when we think about a job of someone who's a waitress, and they also work part-time at a fast food restaurant, they work two jobs, and the concept of meritocracy tells them to, or it promotes that they should continue to work and work and work until they achieve and become a billionaire. Oftentimes that does not even often, most of the time that does not happen. People who work two jobs, and I say these, and when I'm talking about these jobs, I'm talking about service industry. They're not able to move up within life, or within their economics, within their economic level, mainly because those particular jobs, and with those jobs, there are systems in place at the interest of the corporation. And with capitalism, keep costs low, production high. In paying workers a equitable salary or wages would move costs to go up. If costs go up, that means profits go down. Well, not profits per se, but the amount of money that could be saved goes down. So there are laws and systems that keep people who are working within these employments that are not that provide challenges for that person to live a better life. So all that to say is that, now here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that a person can't save up money to get what they want. It's where meritocracy blames that person for not working hard enough to achieve what is considered to be the American dream or the dream. So meritocracy in a nutshell is not a shift, it's a myth. So before we move forward to the next slide, I wondered if you've ever seen this human before. And take a minute. So this is Ed Roberts. Up here I have if we were in person, I would show you this video, this YouTube link. Unfortunately, we are not in person, but I have put up notes with the link so that you may watch it for yourself. So Ed Roberts was a key figure, was a key figure in the independent living movement, where he and many other persons with disabilities advocated for the rights of folks with disabilities. They're a big advocate, and I encourage people to look up this human when they get the chance. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about ableism, now that we've finished through with the history. We've seen it manifest in institutions and higher learning. We also see it within legal system and laws and in healthcare. We're also going to talk about the discourse very broadly about people with disabilities. So we mentioned before ignorance of duties amongst faculty. Even further, the lack of attention to accommodations. It's also important to note that there are fewer job opportunities for people living with disabilities. Let's see if I can find this, for example. When we think about this in particular, a lot of times there are jobs that are not really willing to accommodate people living with disabilities. So instead, they may They may engage in jobs that are menial, are considered to be menial, or within the service industry. Within the legal system, in particular, immigration. So going back to the late 19th century, we saw massive immigration, and within the early 20th centuries, you had a lot of people who were considered to be quote unquote disabled, and we'll talk about what that means. So in 1881, New York actually passed a law that really required some inspection of steamships that would prevent the landing of people who were mendicants, cripples, criminals, idiots. And let's see here. You also had some laws in California that placed the restrictions on immigrants who were considered lunatic, idiot, deaf. Oh, excuse me, that meant idiot. I apologize. Deaf, blind, cripple, or infirm, who wasn't a member of the resident family. And this was actually shortly after the passing of anti-Chinese legislation. And these were actually backup measures to prevent immigrants from entering the country. And this facilitated some medical nativism, basically using medicine or medicalization as a way to exclude immigrants or prevent immigrants from entering into the United States. Alabama actually passed laws that prohibited people with persons of anarchistic tendency, of paupers, or people suffering from contagious or communicative diseases. Earlier, I did mention hate crimes, and I did want to provide some statistics for y'all. Or some instances, excuse me. So there's also routine harassments, and legal enforcements around hate crimes are relatively relaxed. All that to say is that legal enforcements of these crimes are very relaxed and not often looked into. Within prisons, there's actually a difference to persons with disabilities in prisons. So I mentioned, so just to mention, inmates with learning disabilities, for example, the Department of Corrections doesn't necessarily recognize the accommodations for inmates with disabilities. Also, inmates with disabilities are less likely to engage in educational programs when we know that these programs are very much beneficial for these folks. When we think about writing letters in prison, so really what that person would go do if someone has a learning disability or dyslexia, or they're unable to write, or it's due to physical impediments or sensory impairment. If we think about the culture of within prisons, people do things for favors. You do this, I get this. Rarely, so often, is it due out of being just to do it. Let me go right back. And oftentimes, those with these disabilities find themselves in spaces where they're not able to further themselves and engage with others, and especially engage with loved ones. So I have a video up here, and I do hope you get the chance to look at this. This is about the experiences of people with disabilities within prisons. When it comes to discourse within politics, it has typically been negative. And it's often centered around people with disabilities. One of the most egregious forms of ableism within politics or within political discourse is the description of a reporter where then candidate President Donald Trump, then candidate and now President Trump actually mocked a reporter on at a rally. The point here is that when we discuss people with disabilities within political discourse and in front of like the whole world, it's typically negative and further done in a way that is mocking that person. Within healthcare, people with disabilities are disproportionately affected. When we think about the when we think about ACA, the Affordable Care Act, this has raised a lot of concerns about the cost and losses of coverage for people with disabilities. And the American Health Care Act, you found drastic reductions to Medicaid, elimination of services for people with disabilities. And so before I move forward, if you've heard of this human, awesome. The story around this human is rather tragic, rather disheartening. This person was Michael Hickson. Michael Hickson was in a hospital, and what happened was that the doctors in the hospital refused treatment, refused food for him with the defense of he didn't have quality of life. I believe this was during COVID, and Michael Hickson died. Now, this is where we're going to talk a little bit more about intersectionality and having more than one marginalized identity. It's important to remember too that this was a form of paternalism, this idea that someone didn't have quality of life when his wife vigorously advocated for this person. So what we have seen with COVID-19, it has disproportionately impacted people with disabilities. And I have a video up here that highlights the ways in which it has done that. But just to think about that even further, persons with disabilities, they may not have access to treatment, to testing, which further risks them for infections and lack of treatment and death related to COVID-19 complications. Even further, there hasn't been a lot of discussion about people with disabilities within the COVID-19 pandemic, with the exception of talking about people with people who are elderly and with underlying conditions. So when we think about that though, majority of the time when we talk about these conditions, this is in reference to persons with disabilities, and not just, a lot of times it is in reference. So the point being is that there hasn't been a lot of explicit discourse for persons with disabilities, and they're often left out of the conversation. So I'm curious, what do folks think about that? And when we think about the intersections, right, this creates a simultaneous and unique experience where the oppressions overlap with one another. When we think about a male veteran who suffers from, not suffers, who living with PTSD, and a female, a woman rape survivor with PTSD, while the disorder in particular, they're very, is the same. The way in which we treat those individuals are rather different. A woman who survives rape and is diagnosed with PTSD is oftentimes marginalized for her experience. Whereas for someone who is a male veteran with PTSD, there's this patronizing experience where, you know, I'm sorry you had to, you know, you experienced that, you know, thank you for fighting for our country. But then at the same, and we also, there is a lot of care around people who are, you know, who are veterans and they have PTSD. And then at the same time, we're fine with them sacrificing themselves to go off into the wars, as opposed to just addressing things beforehand, such as addressing the war and why you got to go into war in the first place. But once again, that's something for a whole different conversation. The point being is that when it comes to different identities, people with people are going to be treated differently. With racism and ableism, what we have seen, for example, is an overrepresentation of students of color within special education courses. So taken together, when we're thinking about these intersections, these create a unique experience for that individual, and one that is more complex. So we've talked about the historical treatment, we've talked about the individual, institutional, and cultural levels of ableism. Now we're going to move on into the conversation about allyship. One of the things that your book talks about is this awareness of language. So using affirmative language and decreasing negative language. So when we think about affirmative, this is person first. So for example, you notice me saying persons with disability, persons living with disability, as opposed to disabled persons. The reason being is that when you're putting that label first off, disabled, as if to say that something happened to that person and it was ascribed to them, that's not necessarily appropriate. Instead, you're putting the person before their disability. So when we say disabled person, that's negative language. Affirmative language is person first language. So persons with disability. Communication. When talking to persons with disabilities, in particular hearing impediments, speak clearly and in a regular tone, as opposed to using a baby voice, baby-like voice, or talking really slow to that person. That's very demeaning. Using descriptive languages when indicating direction or size. So if a person with a visual impediment, you know, asks about where they could find the trash can, don't just say over there. Be descriptive about it. You might say 3 feet to your left, 3 feet to your right. The point is, be descriptive. Also, identify yourself. Don't just go up to a random person, especially someone who has a visual impediment. and just start talking to them. That's creepy. That's creepy even for me. So really, when it comes to allyship, right, just being yourself, well, excuse me, being aware of ableist language, ableist behavior, um, is really important. And at the same time, you don't want to engage in a way that's paternalistic and patronizing. Something important to note with allyship, it's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to engage in because you're gonna mess up, you're gonna make those mistakes, and you may be called in or you may be called out. It's important to learn from those experiences, and to read up on them, gain as much knowledge as you can. Uh, and I'm hopeful that providing this would be very helpful. Now, just in reference to some of your discussion questions, I believe I broadly answered I broadly answered the ways in which um, we could reduce ableism and so forth and so on. There was a specific question about myself in regards to a disability. I do not have a disability, even though there are moments when I feel as though I'm I have some kind of psychological disorder, maybe being anxious. Um, I do not. I don't have a documented disability, and I do appreciate people who would like their insight on me, and you know, I appreciate that very much. And overall, this concludes the ableism part of this lecture. So I will switch over to doing youth oppression and elder oppression. So adultism and ageism. Oops, hold on, never mind. Groups. So here are some groups that are that you can refer to their website. They have information, a lot of good resources, and I highly encourage you to look at these groups. Now here's where we talk about youth and elder oppression. I will upload a separate video for you to watch that section.